Axel Et all, with me, your blue corn, your favorite host, and Axel. Say hi, Axel.
Hi.
Say something crazy.
Something crazy.
Yeah.
It's spring in Europe. It's not quite spring in the United States. I'm in upstate New York, close to the Canadian border, where it is still quite cold. The snow has melted, but there are no flowers. There's no green grass. There are no leaves out yet. So whatever warm temperature we are looking for has to be generated by our engaging conversation.
Yeah.
Conversation about eco-socialism, and one particular eco-socialism from Germany, East Germany as well as West Germany, incidentally, because he left for the West at some point. His name is Rudolf Bahro.
See, as usual, I'm totally underprepared for everything I'm doing. So let me. Oh, yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, this is the second part. We already talked a bunch about this, but there was more, I heard. So I'm looking forward to learn more from you. Hit us with the good stuff.
All right, all right. So, what did we talk about
Oh man, so much.
before? Well, we talked about lots of different things, of course, but in particular, we looked at three East German eco-socialists: Robert Havemann, Wolfgang Harich, and Rudolf Bahro. And I think we spent some time examining and going over the life trajectories of Robert Havemann and Wolfgang Harich. And we touched upon Rudolf Bahro only briefly, which is interesting because in some ways Rudolf Bahro is probably the most famous of the East German eco-socialists in the West, also because his major book, The Alternative in Eastern Europe, has been translated into English. And it came out with one of the most prominent English language leftist publishing houses, Verso Books.
Ah,
I don't quite remember when exactly, so I have to look it up. I have the book in front of me. So it came out, the English version came out in 1978. The German version came out with Europäische Verlagsanstalt in 1977. So I'm holding the book up. Hopefully, everyone who's watching this can see it. So, The Alternative, probably the most well-known literary product of East German eco-socialists. And it's not just the work of eco-socialism, it's also sort of a critique of real existing socialism in Eastern Europe, a critique of the Soviet system, a Marxist critique of the Soviet system, and an attempt to produce an alternative, emancipatory socialist and communist vision of what should be and what must be if humanity is to survive.
yeah, sounds like
So,
something we should definitely look into. I mean, that's the Frankfurt School thing with the how did Marx call it? Uh, the political economy, and thus the problems arising from all that, the, the workers' problem of freedom, essentially. We all have to grift and survive, and that kind of, for me, immediately clicks with this critique of the Soviet system, which in turn had to operate, yeah, under capitalism as well, right? And thus had to adopt a positivist bureaucracy that was just insane, mind bender bullshit. And we still got that going for us here in the West too now. So welcome to Stalinism, I guess.
Exactly. Stalinism as a project not just for the former East, but for the
Right.
West as
For
well,
the
right?
neoliberal shit lips and their
Yes,
bullshit bombardment of Iran. And then,
yes.
oh
Oh,
yeah, of course, let's hit this massive oil depot and just poison everyone in Tehran.
yes,
That seems to be a nice idea. What the
absolutely.
fuck? So yeah,
Absolutely, yeah.
let's dive into it.
Yeah. Well, I always ask myself, as so many other people do, what is the relevance of looking at these people, looking at Havemann, looking at Bahro, looking at Harich. And there was something I didn't know about Rudolf Bahro that I discovered just recently. He was, and I was vaguely familiar with that, very interested in Beethoven, the composer Ludwig van Beethoven. And apparently that was for many reasons. The music of Beethoven resonated with Bahro, but it also was because of Beethoven's politics. Beethoven was very much drawn to the French Revolution. He was for a while drawn to Napoleon, whom he saw as an emancipatory figure. And then, he became disappointed with Napoleon and the imperialism and the violence and the militarism of the Napoleonic era. And 1815 and the restoration of 1815, the Congress of Vienna, and all of that really put into focus, the disillusionment and the disappointments for Beethoven. And what Bahro found interesting was Beethoven's response, how to deal with disillusionment and disappointment. And many of us are probably confronted with similar questions. How do we deal with, digesting our world, where we have to come to terms with, Trump being in power, Merz being in power, reactionary regimes being on the march in many, many countries, and the left being in retreat. And Bahro's response was to look for new horizons, to not give up on utopia, on utopian projects, but to reframe them to what he said was looking for the next historical hour, preparing for the next historical hour, to re-examine what opportunities might exist, how the struggle will perhaps have to be fought differently under different circumstances. So I thought, dealing with disappointment and how to not lose your revolutionary optimism in the time of reaction and defeat makes Bahro a particularly interesting figure, because there surely were enough disappointments in his life, enough defeats, and looking at how he dealt with them, to me at least, is very interesting. But coming back to the overall significance of Bahro, I introduced him as an East German eco-socialist, and that is to some extent correct. But to some other degree, he is perhaps, out of the three I've mentioned, Havemann and Harich and Bahro, he's probably the least, East German of the East German eco-socialists, because he eventually went to the West, while Havemann and Harich made very explicitly a decision to stay in East Germany. Bahro went to the West. And when he went to the West, he did so explicitly to make West Germany his new home, politically and philosophically and ideologically. He did that. I mean, maybe I can contrast him very briefly with somebody like Wolf Biermann. Wolf Biermann was.
Do you know how he left? I mean, that was a bit of an issue.
Yeah, well,
leave?
he was imprisoned in the GDR, and I will talk about how all of that came to pass in some more detail. He was imprisoned. He got a fairly lengthy prison sentence, 8 years. But after 1 year, East Germany was celebrating its 30th anniversary, and after that 1 year, when the anniversary came up, there was a very large-scale political amnesty. Lots of people were released, and Bahro was released from prison as well. But a condition of his release from prison was that he would have to leave East Germany. The East German leadership wanted to get rid of him, essentially.
He got it on a silver platter.
We let you go, but you have to go. You have to go and leave our country to never return.
You gotta leave.
And yes, and Bahro took them up, and he left. So he went to the West, and Biermann, a few years earlier, went to the West as well. He performed at a concert, and East Germany decided not to let him back in. And while Biermann, the songwriter Biermann, stayed in the West, he essentially made it his mission to remain an East German dissident living in the West, being focused on, cultivating himself as an East German living in the West. That was his
rub it under their noses.
Exactly, his self-understanding. While Bahro's idea was, I'm now in the West. The West is my new home. My real focus will be to criticize West German society. So he did not repudiate his East German past, but he actually wanted to reconcile with East Germany. He remained very critical of the East German state socialist project, but he did not conceive of himself as an East German living in West Germany. He conceived of himself as now somebody whose new home is in West Germany, and he wholeheartedly embraced this new life and played a key role in the founding of a new political party in West Germany, the Green Party. So he, in that sense, can be seen not only as an East German eco-socialist, but as a West German eco-socialist, and eventually as a German eco-socialist when Germany, in quotation marks, reunified in 1990, because it was not a real reunification, but the absorption of East Germany by West Germany.
Exactly.
Rudolf Bahro is was, I should say, a very contradictory figure. He was a Marxist until the end of his life. At the same time, he became infatuated with spiritualist ideas, with religious ideas, with esoteric ideas, to an almost grotesque extent, inasmuch as he came to go to the United States briefly and spend some time with an American Indian guru named Bhagwan. I don't know whether too many people still remember Bhagwan and
the name
his
rings a
movement.
bell. Definitely.
Yes, so a very problematic figure who preached from time to time egalitarianism, while also owning I think 70 or so Rolls Royce. So in any event, the esotericism of Bahro was something that irked many of his older comrades in arms. So Bahro was quite a character in many ways, and like many interesting characters, there were interesting contradictions to his personality and to his thinking as well. So to talk a little bit about his biographical trajectory and then connect them with his ideas. He was born 1935. He will die in 1977. It's not originally from either East or West Germany. He's from the real East Germany. He was born in Lower Silesia, which after World War II became part of Poland. He ended up in East Germany, and probably because of his experiences as a refugee, he very strongly came to identify with East Germany. He rejected German nationalism. He rejected the Nazi state, of course, and he joined the SED, the East German Communist Party, which officially was called the Socialist Unity Party, composed of the old Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party, that were forcibly unified under the leadership of the Communist Party in 1946. So he joins the SED in the early 1950s. He is very intellectually engaged. He has an interest in philosophy, which he ends up studying at Humboldt University in East Berlin. He ends up getting a doctorate in philosophy as well. The subject matter of his PhD dissertation is the poet and writer Johannes R. Becher, who started out as an expressionist poet and then later on turned to socialist realism and became Minister for Cultural Affairs in East Germany. And Bahro is a philosophy student, and he is at Humboldt University in the late the mid to late 1950s, 1956, 1957, which is somewhat significant because 1956, 1957 is a very interesting time at Humboldt University, because the first major debates take place among Marxist, Leninist philosophers. 1956 is the year when the 20th Party Congress takes place in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev reveals some of the crimes committed during the Stalin years. In this sends shockwaves around the communist movements, the communist parties of the world, including the SED, and people who previously towed the party line in almost every aspect began to have second thoughts about many of the more dogmatic assertions. So the first more critical debates start to take place. And Bahro is part of this climate. He does not position himself on the forefront of these debates, but he is critical enough to move into the gaze of the Stasi, the East German secret police. So they start observing him for a couple of months, but eventually they lose interest because they regard him as not a major troublemaker. But they open a file on him, albeit relatively briefly. In terms of turning points in his life, he's still a deeply committed supporter of the German Democratic Republic and its model of socialism. But he begins to have some second thoughts, some doubts, because after all, if Stalin turned out to be, a person who is now being condemned by Khrushchev, the leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, then many things that used to be sacrosanct are, maybe not what they appear to be. But what really turns Bahro into a very critical Marxist is the Prague Spring of 1968. So he undergoes a journey between 1956 and 1968 in terms of turning from an orthodox Marxist-Leninist into a heterodox Marxist.
Radicalization.
The radicalization, right? Absolutely, radicalization. But in the 1950s, what seems to be his first book is published in the GDR. And many of his books, in fact, most of his really influential books will be published not in the GDR, but in West Germany, because they are too radical for the GDR and too subversive to be published there. But the book that was published in the GDR is a collection of political poems. And there's one poem I want to read, at least an excerpt, because while it illustrates his political and philosophical orthodoxy, it also illustrates his revolutionary spirit. So the poem is called "To the Students of My University." And there's one line or a set of lines that struck me. Marx is with us, resurrected in us. Lenin's breath casts the serenity of quiet dreamers into chaos. Young thinkers, let us go to the class front. Now, the East German state did not regard this poem as problematic. On the contrary, they liked it because it endorses the revolutionary spirit of Marx. It illustrates that Marx is resurrected in us, in the East German, comrades. Lenin's breath casts the serenity of quiet dreamers into chaos. So it's a call to arms in terms of the revolutionary commitment of young comrades in the GDR. So all of that would resonate with the party leadership, and at the same time, it also illustrates, to me at least, Bahro's restless spirit, his commitment. Lenin's breath casts the serenity of quiet dreamers into chaos. To some extent, it's a little surprising to me that East German censors were not, maybe some were somewhat dismayed, because if East German leaders wanted anything, they wanted to avoid chaos. Right?
Yeah, but they saw the other side thrown into chaos. So
they wanted
interesting.
Conformity. Yeah. They wanted stability. Yeah. They wanted, predictability, as opposed to, a revolutionary spirit that was potentially unpredictable. And so what this foreshadows to me is a future conflict, because Bahro's Marxism was, from the very beginning, even when it was still relatively orthodox, a utopian Marxism. Mm-hmm. That wanted to transform the world, that wanted to transform East Germany, and accepted the more, bland conditions in East Germany only as transitory. And in fact, Bahro wrote about that later on. He said when he realized that the East German leadership only wanted to go so far, to them, the building of the East German state and developing the power of the party was not in order to actually allow for a genuine socialist transformation, but to only maintain their own power. At that point, he became fundamentally critical of real existing socialism.
Yeah,
and he
but
came to see it as something that is really at odds with the Marxism of Marx,
exactly.
and incidentally the Leninism of Lenin as well.
Which is all in the poem. And that's so interesting that we always see ourselves as the good dreamers, like in this poem, that have to overcome their silence, to throw the world into chaos so that socialism can be realized or whatever. But it's always the other and us. So this is going to a critique of liberalism as such, that is the foundation of Marx, of the communist project that comes out of this bourgeois project of liberalism, and the liberation of the world, which then kind of turned on its head, and we are now back into Stalinism. So this is all kind of, when you point to someone else to point out a problem and blackmail someone and label them the issue, there's always four fingers pointing back at you. And that is all becoming visual with this piece of art. So, yeah, heads up for the artist.
Absolutely, yes. And the notion, that it's not about making things function smoothly, but to, in some ways, put sand into the engines of the world, to be a disruptive force, right? Not to maintain the status quo, because the status quo is so deeply problematic. And to not be satisfied with, minor improvements because they're not nearly enough, along the lines of one step forward, two steps back. So this notion of the utopian spirit is something of importance to Bahro, and it's clear, that he would sooner or later, as an intelligent person, realize that the East German regime is, despite its rhetoric, most certainly not a utopian regime, but a regime that is there to maintain and stabilize the status quo.
Interestingly.
So, in any event, he's still committed to the DDR, and he's very idealistic. So in the late 1950s, he accepts a position as a journalist, as editor-in-chief of the party newspaper at the University of Greifswald in northern East Germany. And then a little later, he gets a position as the cultural editor of Forum, which, contrary to the party newspaper at the University of Greifswald, was a national publication for students in all of East Germany. And he gets that position in 1965. In 1965 is significant because, and this sounds like a stupid observation, 1965 follows 1964, obviously. But what happened in 1964? In East Germany, 1964 is a very significant year because the 11th plenum took place in 1964. The 11th plenum was an event, a bureaucratic event, a party conference within the Communist Party, the SED. And it essentially signified the end of a political thaw, of an era of relative, well, I don't like that term really, liberalization, because there are problems, as we all know, with liberalism itself. So liberalization, but it essentially stands for a period of relaxation of censorship and the freeing up of the cultural sphere. On August 13th, 1961, the wall was built. And incidentally and counterintuitively, the building of the wall actually increased opportunities for cultural emancipation and freedom of expression in East Germany. The East German regime, the SED regime, felt more secure, and thus it decided to relax censorship, allowed for more critical authors to publish, to do things that were not possible before or after. So the time period between 1961, August 1961, and 1964 was in some ways perhaps the most experimental time period in East Germany, where critical things could be published that were not publishable before or after. And all of this ends at the so-called 11th plenum, where Politburo member Kurt Harger gave a speech essentially saying it is now time to pursue a more, quote, proletarian policy, which inaugurated what some have called a new ice age. So things begin to close again after the 11th plenum in 1964. So when Bahro becomes the cultural editor of Forum in 1965, the conditions, the political and cultural conditions are much more restrictive than they were a year earlier. But he doesn't accept that. He does not accommodate himself to this so-called new ice age. And he wants to continue to do things that would have been possible a year earlier. So there is a text by Volker Braun, also a committed party member, but a critical party member. And Bahro decides to publish this piece, even though it is clear he will not make friends with allowing for the publication of that piece. And this means Bahro will get fired and he will be reprimanded. So not only will he get fired, he will be demoted. His next position will be, he will become a sociological research assistant to the director of the rubber and asbestos company in Berlin, Weißensee. And he will have that position for quite a few years. He will get that job in 1967. And it is clearly meant as a demotion, but it will turn out to be a blessing for Bahro, because it will give Bahro a great deal of free time. He can essentially do whatever he wants to do. He will have the opportunity to do empirical research at an East German factory. Again, a factory that manufactures rubber and asbestos-related products. So he will have the opportunity to see how real existing socialism happens on a factory level in great detail. Officially, he's going to work on his Habilitation, which is a term that is very difficult to translate into English. It's essentially a second dissertation that is required if you want to teach at the university.
Please give me a job again, would be the other
Yes,
headline.
yes. So, and but in reality, he will obviously, um, do research for his habilitation, which deals with a project that looks at how to increase the creativity of managers in East German companies. But his real project is that book, The Alternative. So he's writing this book. It will take him a total of 8 years. And he essentially has this position as a sociological research assistant, which means there's very little he has to do in terms of actual duties. He gets paid, and he has a lot of time doing research and writing. So it's I think not 8 years, 9 years it takes him to write The Alternative, this most famous book of his. The Alternative is divided into 3 parts. The first part deals with the history of actually existing socialism, how it came to be. The second part is an analysis of the anatomy of actually existing socialism. And the third part, perhaps the most interesting part, is Bahro's vision of a communist alternative and specific strategies that deal with how to reach this alternative. And looking at these various parts in more detail. The first part, the history of real existing socialism, he calls that the non-capitalist road to industrial society. So the history of real existing socialism is to him the non-capitalist road to industrial society. So he makes a point of conceiving of it not as actual socialism, but as a non-capitalist road. So he argues it's not a capitalist path, but it's definitely not a real socialist path either. So he, at this point, concluded that the system that developed in the Soviet bloc was a system that cannot really be considered genuine socialism. He argues it was a system that was forced on the Soviet Union because it was a underdeveloped state prior to the October Revolution. It was internationally isolated. There were no successful revolutions in countries that already went through capitalist development, such as Germany. So the Bolsheviks really had no alternative. But that system of 5-year plans, the command economy, etc., it cannot really be equated with any kind of real socialism. And while there is some historical justification for its implementation on Soviet soil and maybe on the soil of Poland, there was no justification for its implementation on the territory of Czechoslovakia or East Germany, because those countries already went through capitalist developments, or the introduction of the Soviet model there was historically regressive. So in any event, this book causes an immense upheaval when it appears. And even before it appears, it circulates in terms of, unauthorized copies. So people such as Rudi Dutschke will read manuscripts of it and will have an interesting reaction. So I want to say a few things about how different constituencies, different readership groups respond to it. I want to say something about how the SED responded to it, and how the East German opposition responded to it, and how different groups within the West responded to it. And well, how did they respond to it? First of all, the SED. One has to distinguish between the party leadership, the party apparatus, and the rank and file membership. The party leadership, they, of course, disliked the book. Most did not read it, but those who did read it try to frame it as anti-communist propaganda. One example is Politburo member Alfred Norden. He wrote to Erich Honecker, who probably didn't read the book or the manuscript, and said it's typical work of anti-communist agitation. It's potentially very dangerous because it could reach a large audience. It's meant to delegitimize the entire socialist project since the October Revolution. We have to make sure it never gets published. Bahro is an enemy of socialism. He is very dangerous. We need to arrest him. We need to punish him. We need to make an example out of him. The book is essentially, written by an anti-communist who is very deliberately anti-communist and means us great harm. This perception was not shared by everyone within the SED apparatus. There's a more interesting response by Hans Koch, who was the director of the Institute for Culture and Arts at the Academy of Science in East Germany, the Akademie der Wissenschaften. He was also a mid-level member of the party bureaucracy. He was a member of the Volkskammer, the People's Deputy Chamber, East Germany's parliament. And later on, he was elected to the Central Committee. Incidentally, he committed suicide in 1986. And I don't know whether one can attribute any political significance to his suicide, but he was the most high-ranking member who was officially acknowledged of having committed suicide, the most high-ranking member of the SED. So he rejects the book as well, of course, but he does not reject it by saying it is just a work of anti-communist propaganda written by a sworn enemy of East Germany and an anti-communist. Koch argues that Bahro is a utopian communist whose main fault is that he is too impatient. He does not understand the far more carefully calibrated strategy of the SED. He demands too quickly a move into communism. So he's not saying that Bahro is anti-communist. He's saying he's a naive communist, a utopian communist as opposed to a realistic communist. So his critique of the book is different from the critique of the top layers of the party leadership. He's not denouncing Bahro as anti-communist, but as, being too communist or being an ultra-leftist, so to say, which is quite interesting. What's also interesting is that the SED has a difficult time convincing the majority, or at least most or all party members, to condemn the book. There's quite a bit of pushback on part of average party members. Many of them say, well, we know we're supposed to hate the book, but we're not able to read it. So how can we condemn the book if we don't know the book? We're now curious about the book, right?
Now I want to read it.
So we want to read it. So there is a notable resistance to condemning the book, or just adopting, the official line that the book is trash and nonsense and should be condemned. So there is there's notable skepticism in terms of, well, if the book is so bad, why can't we see that?
Why is it censored? Yeah.
Yeah. Why is it, why is it, why are you hiding it?
It's not
so
exactly Hitler's Mein Kampf or some bullshit,
Exactly.
where you
Exactly.
could kind of
Exactly.
have a case.
Exactly. So, how does the East German opposition respond to the book? Well, the book is written for the East German opposition, the leftist, the Marxist opposition. And what Bahro wants is to present the book in terms of looking for new horizons. Bahro polemicizes against Trotskyism by saying, we should not recycle and copy Trotskyist tropes. The Trotskyist opposition belongs to the past. They were defeated by the Stalinists, and there are reasons for their defeat. We should not reconnect with that kind of opposition. We should find a new way, which goes hand in hand with what he wrote in one of his Beethoven essays, essentially saying, we have to not recycle the language of the past. That language is now dead. We have to look for the new historical hour. The new historical hour means we have to reach a new audience, and we have to prepare for the opportunities of the future. And thus a strong focus on ecology, the ecological transformation. And that goes hand in hand with his partial critique of Marx. He essentially advocates in the alternative as well as his future projects for a red-green alliance. But this amounts to essentially saying that Marxism needs to be greened. It is not yet green enough. An ecological critique has to be introduced to Marxism. It does not exist within Marxism. And that makes him very much, his work, part of the first stage of eco-socialism, as John Bellamy Foster conceives of eco-socialism. John Bellamy Foster argues that eco-socialism had a first and a second stage, and the first stage was essentially dominated by those scholars who argued that the mature Marx, not the early Marx of the 1844 manuscripts, but the mature Marx it came to embrace productivist and Promethean elements. And thus an eco-socialist critique has to be critical of that kind of an approach. And there is a book that came out in the 1960s. Let me find the exact title of that book. Yes, it's Alfred Schmidt's The Concept of Nature in Karl Marx. It was published in 1962. It was originally written as a dissertation under Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. And it very much promotes this idea of the mature Marx being problematic in ecological terms. And to some extent, Bahro seems to have internalized this idea as well, meaning he advocates the idea that Marxism has to experience an ecological redirection. Second stage, eco-socialism offers a different take on the mature Marx as well. And it's shaped very much by books such as John Bellamy Foster's Marx Ecology, which came out in 2000, or Paul Burkett's Marx and Nature, which was published in 1999. And Burkett and John Bellamy Foster argue, contrary to Schmidt and Bahro, that the mature Marx actually was eco-socialist as well, and developed a theory of the ecological rift, and thus there's no need for an ecological correction of Marx, because Marx was ecological far more consistently than first-generation eco-socialists realized.
Could you explain that for us?
Pardon me?
Could you explain that for us? What that means, this ecological rift?
The ecological rift, I was planning on going into that in more detail a little later, but essentially it's the idea that there is a rift that develops within the context of capitalism between what Marx called the universal metabolism of nature and the social metabolism. And that rift develops especially in capitalist agriculture. Marx studied very carefully the works of lots of people, such as the economists Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and Thomas Malthus, and Malthus and Ricardo look at soil essentially as an inexhaustible resource that cannot be compromised in any fashion. But Marx became fascinated with the works of Justus von Liebig, a German chemist, a Bavarian chemist, who looked at the impact of capitalist agriculture on soil in England in particular, and noticed nutrient depletion, the exhaustion of the soil, the robbery of the soil, the Raubwirtschaft, the robbery economy of the soil. And this robbery of nature, which incidentally would become the title of one of John Bellamy Foster's books later on, is something that Marx noted as a key feature of capitalism, that capitalism essentially harms not just human beings, but nature as well. And there is a quote in Das Kapital that John Bellamy Foster notices early on: all progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the act not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. Capitalist production therefore only develops the techniques and the degree of combination of the critical source of wealth, the soil and the worker. Yeah. So what John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett note is that Marx and Engels in his Dialectic of Nature develop an ecological critique of capitalism. And this ecological critique of capitalism is something that the first generation of eco-socialists did not emphasize and understand as fully as the second generation of eco-socialists. So essentially, what Bahro does is he develops this argument for a red-green alliance, which is, of course, very important and very necessary, but it becomes eventually mixed with all sorts of other things that will lead him into some problematic waters with many of his earlier allies. For example, he will come up in later publications with the idea that a new political system should develop where a green prince should lead society.
Oh my fucking God.
So
Is he already messing with esoterics at that point?
Exactly, exactly. And some of it is, well, the thing is, it's some of it is also perhaps a matter of unfortunate phrases and, expressions that were not fully thought out.
Yeah, why not a princess,
Yeah, because there is the idea of a green prince that is problematic, and his most problematic phrase is his call for a green Adolf, a grüner Adolf.
Yeah.
Now, to put this into context, the call for a grüner Adolf came up in an interview between him and the newspaper Junge Welt in the early 90s. And he made it clear that the grüne Adolf would be fundamentally different from a brauner Adolf, a brown Adolf. So it's not a call for Nazism, but it's an extremely unfortunate term, right?
Yeah, because how could you take it differently? And also,
there would be a million ways of expressing that sentiment differently. It's an incredibly unfortunate term. So
yeah, not only that, it's also he exactly got what he was calling for, but little did he know about the development in Germany under capitalism, how the Green Party would morph into another conservative essentially another conservative party that did under Corona horrible politics. Like that was some really mean stuff and nothing you could pick up on for a left-green alliance. That's
absolutely.
That's now
I agree. And in all fairness, he left the Green Party in 1985. Right. And he had early on, even in the early 80s, he had big conflicts with Joschka Fischer. He belonged to the Fundi wing, the fundamentalist wing. The Greens early on developed two wings, the so-called Realo wing and the Fundi wing, as you know. And these two wings, the so-called realist wing won out, and the so-called fundamentalist wing, the original Greens, they were fully marginalized and pushed aside, and he finally left the party in 1985. And even though in that Junge Welt interview, because of that interview where he talked about the Green Adolf, people labeled him an eco-fascist. He was not an eco-fascist, just as Wolfgang Harich was labeled an eco-fascist, and he was not really an eco-fascist either, even though some of his statements had perhaps somewhat of an eco-fascist, or could have perhaps an eco-Stalinist flavor. Both Harich and Bahro understood the danger of eco-fascism developing perhaps as a response to an ecological crisis, when the ecological collapse reaches a certain stage of resource scarcity and brutalization, and they regarded it as something deeply undesirable. So they definitely did not identify with any kind of eco-fascism. But the very phrase,
the framing is horrible.
Illustrates his lack of judgment on some core issues. essentially what he wanted to do was he wanted to build bridges to conservatives who had ecological concerns. One can argue about how feasible that is, whether leftists should try to seek alliances with conservatives who have ecological concerns. I think it is clear that his approach is this phrase green Adolf was absolutely destructive and unhelpful. He also argued, of course, that doesn't have to be a man, it can be a woman as well. It became incredibly convoluted. His fascination with Bhagwan, which didn't last very long, was equally convoluted. In general, his interest in esotericism was very eclectic. He became interested in Zen Buddhism, in Native American sweat lodge rituals, and so on and so forth. All of this led to his increasing isolation. Many of his former allies came to see him in the mid to late 1980s, increasingly as a marginal figure who wanted things that became more and more incomprehensible to the majority of left-green people. What made Bahro relevant again, incidentally, was the collapse of East Germany and German reunification. When East Germany collapsed, Bahro made a point of rejuvenating, rediscovering, re-emphasizing his background as a former East German. He went back to East Germany. He gave several speeches at the SED, which was transforming itself from the Socialist Unity Party into the Party for Democratic Socialism. It's a very interesting transformation because democratic socialism was very, ideologically
frowned upon.
Fraud upon, to say the least. Phrase real existing socialism labeled democratic socialism as another word for anti-communism. Now the same party called itself the Party for Democratic Socialism. So it's a fundamental transformation of the former Communist Party into something else. And Bahro spoke at several party events, and he essentially said to the party leaders, do not adopt West Germany's economic system. The West German market economy is environmentally catastrophic. Pursue instead an ecological transformation. So he talked about ecology. He also made some very sensible points in addition to his ecological comments about how, this new party leadership should not just blame the old leaders, Erich Honecker and Erich Mielke and all the old members of the Politburo for whatever went wrong, but they should recognize their own role in the failures of East Germany, and they should try to focus on creating a better future, and the focus should be on an eco-socialist alternative, neither Stalinism nor Western capitalism. At the same time, Bahro was able to, be fairly pragmatic. For example, he built a connection, a relationship with Kurt Biedenkopf, who at that point was the premier or governor of the state of Saxony. Kurt Biedenkopf belonged to the more progressive wing of the Christian Democratic Union, and he had talked for quite a while about the so-called ecological transformation of the social market economy. And Bahro, who at that point was a distinguished professor at Humboldt University. During the end of East Germany and German unification, Bahro suddenly became fashionable again. And at the very end of East Germany established an Institute for Social Ecology for him at Humboldt University and made him a distinguished professor there. And Bahro, as the director of this Institute for Social Ecology and a distinguished professor, invited Kurt Biedenkopf to give a talk on ecology. And within the context of that talk, Biedenkopf offered Bahro the opportunity to set up an experimental ecological community in Saxony, the so-called Lebensgut farm in Pomritz, which was a small village somewhere in Saxony.
The framing, guys. Lebensborn, Lebensgut. Hallo.
Yeah, absolutely right. Maybe you can explain what makes the framing problematic.
Well, it already has this brown Nazi taste. And when you know that he called also for the green Adolf, I mean, I see the system working. That's repeating the same fucking mistakes. Always working with this. And the Nazis, I mean, they loved nature as long as you could exploit resources for the Father Reich, you know. So, and they wanted to have it nice and green, but that's not all of it. And there's something seriously wrong with all of this, and with his whole with the way he, I don't know, carries himself already into spiritism, not just esoterics. I mean, he's an alchemist who tries to turn lead into gold. You know, someone who tries to work on himself to become a better human, to become the human Marx was dreaming about. You know, that's the kind of esoterics I'm kind of fascinated about. And it always comes up again, especially in a person like him with his background. There's something amiss in this communist atheism, and it's equally amiss in this capitalist postmodern society we've created for ourselves, where people leave the churches but go straight back into brown propaganda and mythology. And
Absolutely.
this new vibe with homeopathics, and that's aligned somehow with the political right, and that's also weird, but it also helps people, and we don't have all the answers. I mean, that's not what science tries to do. You know, it's so there's a lot going on there. And, however, and I was just picking up on the Lebens part,
The name of it,
the
absolutely.
name of it alone, and then suddenly you have this. At least I have this shit going on in my head where all the connections are picked up again, and the first thing I'm intuitively thinking about is Lebensborn, where the Nazis had this project to produce an Aryan race and actually bring couples together so they can produce the overhuman, you know, and it goes into that as well, because it has this control fetish, this authoritarian personality already built into it, you know?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. So there is definitely a problem with the naming and the framing, but I think it is more complicated. And one, name that kind of illustrates the complications is the name Hölderlin.
Yeah.
He is very interested in Friedrich Hölderlin, right? He likes Hölderlin's poems. He likes Hölderlin's philosophy and Hölderlin's mysticism. And when it comes to Hölderlin, two things might come to mind, right? There's on the one hand, Hölderlin's appropriation by the political right. Martin Heidegger, for example, and his attempt to claim Hölderlin. And at the same time, Hölderlin also belongs to the political left. Hölderlin identified with the French Revolution. Hölderlin identified with the Jacobins. He saw himself as a Jacobin, right? Stefan Hamlin, incidentally, wrote about Hölderlin with great empathy and sympathy. So that is quite interesting. At the same time, Stefan Hamlin also had some degree of sympathy, not sympathy, but perhaps at least aesthetic sympathy in a very complicated fashion, though, for Ernst Jünger.
Oh, yeah.
Which makes all of these things
More
very
complicated.
more complicated, exactly. So
do you know
complicated is definitely something that one has to use when talking about Rudolf Bahro, right? In some ways, he was politically naive, used terms and ideas and people he was not fully familiar with. Again, as far as Bhagwan is concerned, right? I'm convinced he did not know about Bhagwan's Rolls Royce, etc.
Maybe he just didn't care. That's the other option.
That's the other option.
That he was so frustrated by his ideological journey or whatever that he turned into I don't know, nihilist more. And then,
but that's definitely conceivable. And again, people have all sorts of cognitive dissonances, right?
Right.
But Bhagwan's lifestyle is irreconcilable with any kind of ecological sustainability, right?
Yeah, sure. But I mean, rational.
To put it mildly, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the alternative and Bhagwan's Rolls Royce don't square. You cannot reconcile them by any means, and that must. That must have been at some point, and he left. So he turned away from Bhagwan. So, but to me, the most perplexing thing is why didn't he see that at the very beginning? I mean, the fact that Bhagwan is fraudulent should have been clear to him from the very beginning.
Yeah, it sounds like deeper personal crisis, and we humans are not only rational. I've been through rough patches myself. I've seen that happening with myself. So I'm just more conscious about that, about the limits of my own rationalizing. And I mean, at some point you get into contact with God and you might not be prepared. you know. So,
Yes.
and there's something you can take from that. So I think that's still something to take away from this this turn to esotericism, and not just esoterics as a tool, as a work of science, as a project for I don't know, personal and society development, whatever, but as an exit, if you were, from all the rationalizations of from himself, from all this work, from how do you put this together. But there's something. I mean, he had this other break when he was certainly already critical of the system of Stalinism, but then when I think there was the Perestroika movement that cleaned up with Stalinism, and it always struck me as a little bit of whitewashing, where the current administration gets to point fingers at Stalin, and he gets to take all of that shit with him into his grave. And now we know there have been other people involved who were leading the secret services and whatnot, and there's a system at work. And it's also kind of fishy when you have the new boss telling you, hey, the old boss is, by the way, he is the one to blame for all our current problems. That's where I turn to him and say, okay, you're not the new boss, I'm the new boss now, because you are the source of all our current problems with this shit. You know, so there's something going on. And certainly there was something going on with Stalinism and the Stasi and whatever, but we still have this shit going on in the West. I mean, they are not shooting people at the wall for fleeing the state. No, it's the other way around. We have now Frontex killing people who want to come to Europe. So
in much larger numbers, incidentally.
Yeah. And there's still something lurking in the shadows, haunting us and our also liberal democracies, that is deeply Stalinist at its core. And it's the old problem again. I think we're going to talk about this in the future more, because it's happening all the time, but there we are.
Absolutely.
At the roots of it all. So this was very good, learning about Bahro. That was fun.
Yeah. I mean, those people are very, one of many lessons to me is these people, you know, they should not be lionized or idealized, right? There's a story where one of Robert Havermann's sons complained about, you know, Robert Havemann being treated as sort of a monument. And that is certainly the wrong approach. And you see similar approaches as far as Sakharov is concerned, or other figures. You know, none of them were saints in any fashion, and it's important to look at their contributions as well as their limitations, and it's important to look at larger structures and larger cultural dynamics, and see the larger context of you know, what unfolded inside of them and around them as well.
Nah, fuck that. We need idols.
Well, in many ways, there seems to be a fundamental human need for some idols. At the same time, it seems to be, it is, I think, also deeply problematic, because it leads us to, look past obviously problematic aspects.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I would agree with that. That is intrinsically human. That's something we get with, I don't know, get to pick up with our mother milk. Seems to be more the product of capitalization, monetization, exploitation.
Intrinsically human, as in not part of human nature, but in terms of the way we have been cultured, the way we have been socialized. Yes,
our material conditions, and that's
absolutely.
That's the other part of the equation. Yeah, very good. I just realized already nearly 1.5 hours went by, and time just flew by again. Good thing we are doing this regularly. It's just a little time sink for me.
Absolutely. Yes.
Anything else you want to say, or should we end it here?
Yeah, well, I can just mention a few more things in terms of the East German opposition. They looked at Bahro as an alternative to Sakharov and to Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn, of course, given his deeply Slavophile and reactionary philosophy, was not something they wanted to emulate, and Sakharov, by and large, represented largely, just liberal concerns, while Bahro still advocated for some sort of a socialist project, at least as far as the alternative stage is concerned. Hence, it became, increasingly problematic as he embraced more and more esoteric ideas in the 1980s. In terms of people who were drawn to Bahro, I've mentioned Bahro rejected Trotskyism. Incidentally, one of Europe's most famous Trotskyists, even though he should not be reduced just to Trotskyism, Ernest Mandel, thought very highly of Bahro. He considered the alternative as the most significant work within Marxist thought that was published within the last 30 years when it came out. And Rudi Dutschke. At first, when Rudi Dutschke read a photocopied manuscript of the alternative before it was even published, he thought it was a Stasi ruse to kind of, because he was working on a similar book, his dissertation, which made somewhat similar arguments about the nature of the Soviet system. And it came out as a book later on under the title, and it was not translated into English, I don't think, Lenin vom Kopf auf die Füße gestellt. Lenin to be put from his head on his feet. And for some reason, Dutschke apparently thought Bahro didn't write it. It was written by the Stasi as a way of mocking Dutschke's work. He didn't, take it seriously. He thought it was just, a provocation by the Stasi. But then he realized this is real and Bahro is an actual person. He was very, impressed by it and said, if it's written by a SED person, which Bahro was still officially, an SED apparatchik of some sort, a sociological assistant. That means, they're critical Marxists within the ranks of the SED. Eventually, when Bahro ended up in West Germany, they met, and while they didn't always see eye to eye, they were allies. Bahro and Dutschke played a role in the founding of the Green Party back when the Greens were still green. They belonged to the red-green wing, and then Dutschke died, of course, very
The Green
tragically.
Party in its spring, not in
The Green
autumn
Party
and winter.
in its spring. Yes, I mean, I remember Franz Josef Strauss saying the Greens are like the tomatoes. At first they're green, then they turn red. So that was, I think, the vision of Dutschke and Bahro, and reality turned out very differently.
Yeah.
I don't know who said they're neoliberals on bikes. I think it was Jutta Dittfurt, and at least with that diagnosis, she is absolutely correct.
It's electro bikes now.
Yes, of course, which makes it even more problematic. Yes, so, but down the road, we should perhaps talk a little more about degrowth and eco-socialism. And
I cannot afford to grow the channel with that stuff. Okay, well, that was one of the cheaper puns. Enough with that. No, we can, let's do that next time, maybe. I don't know. Whatever we feel like.
Sounds good. Sounds good. There's certainly a lot to talk about still.
Yeah. If we are still there in, I don't know, 2 weeks or so.
Sounds great. Yes.
Okay. All right, then that was that. Thanks for having you around, doing this with me.
You're very welcome.
And see you next time, people. Bye-bye.